All right, Chris, we're creating a character. Let's roll for our stats.
Wait, I don't really care about stats though.
Oh.
Hi, I'm Chris.
And I'm Matt.
Welcome to Roleplay Chat.
We're two dungeon masters or game masters who just can't stop talking about role-playing games.
Yes, and today we're talking about creating characters. How different aspects define a character, how the books tell you to do it, and how we do it.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do it, and there's a lot of different elements. It can be quite daunting, even for someone who has been in the hobby for a very long time. So we're going to talk about all those things, and even touch on some of the theories that some people have on what creates a fun or interesting player character. Things like having a broken character, or things like relevance to the plot.
Min-maxing, we'll touch on that.
Stats, powers, player abilities, all these kinds of things. And of course, story elements, something that the two of us are very fond of, if you haven't found that out already. So I think we're about ready for this, Chris.
I'm ready, Matt.
Let's roleplay chat.
All right, first question. What's important for you when you create a character, Matthew?
When I'm creating a player character for myself, I think the most fun for me is coming up with a kind of quirky personality that's going to be interesting to act, interesting to roleplay, and dynamic, fun, and kind of silly almost. I think of things like accents. Maybe he's going to speak a little bit like this. Or maybe he'll speak like this. I mean, that'd be hard. That'd hurt my voice after a long session. But anyway, I try to think of interesting personalities. I like to think of it almost as like an improv acting challenge to myself. I'm far from an actor.
But that's part of the roleplay experience, right? Role-playing is kind of acting on a small scale.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's things like that, little quirks, little personalities, and that's usually the thing that kind of I build my character around. Yeah. So I think of, maybe it's from a TV show. I'm like, oh, that's an interesting character that I would like to play. That's kind of how I start. I start with the personality, the accents, the quirks, and then I unravel all the other stuff from there.
Okay. That's not the way I do it, but the last character I did, inspired by kind of your way of doing it, I tried it and I really liked it. Like starting with how I want to act, starting from that and going backward from that point was very interesting for me and different from what I usually do.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I guess we'll find out if that pays off in the long run for you. That's always been my challenge with it, is that because I'm focusing on the way they act, I tend to forget about the way that they ought to evolve in the story and in the campaign. Maybe I just need to be more cognizant of that and try to focus on it a little bit more. So I'm interested to see how that works out for you.
Yeah, because like you said, usually what I do when I create characters is what you basically said right now, is I start with how I want them to evolve. Usually I have like a question, something a bit more like a philosophical question that I want to answer, maybe about myself, maybe about the world or anything. But I usually think about how they can evolve, maybe a best case scenario and a worst case scenario, and basically throw that to the GM and see what comes out of it. But it's true that starting with the quirky mannerism and stuff like that, then it becomes a bit more, I don't want to say shallow, but like less...
It feels more surface level, right?
Yeah, it feels more surface level. It feels like really fun and more short term. So I'm also looking forward to see the evolution I can incorporate in that character, because usually that's the main thing, and they're not that, I don't want to say fun to play, but it's not at their core.
So I guess you guys can tell already that when we create our player characters, we think a lot about story. Something that I think we ought to ask ourselves here, Chris, is where do stats fit in? for you, when you're creating a character, how much focus do you pay to your statistics, your powers, your abilities, all that kind of stuff?
Yes. I mean, it's always ability depends on the system, but what I do for at least Fate and other systems that I usually use is I make the stat represent the character I wanted to have. But when I'm starting to think about stats, I usually have a good idea of what that character is about.
Mm-hmm.
So, like as an example, in the Fate system, you have like a pyramid of different stats. I would usually like the first three, like the top three, would be obvious at this point. I'm not even asking the question; like they are obvious.
Okay.
The lower one, not so much, but that's not really important. So I would feel like if I would to create like even that in D&D, I would have an idea, and I would like to work with more of a stat block where I could actually put it where I want it to represent the character I want to play, and not let fate
Yeah,
represent.
roll your dice and let it decide. I know a lot of people are like extremely into rolling dice. They think, that's part of the game is rolling the dice, seeing where they land, and just rolling with the punches.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I agree with you that when I'm playing a character, I want to play this character for a decent amount of time. If I'm letting the dice dictate what they're good at and what they're bad at, it might ruin the fun for me. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think the only case I would do that is if like I have no idea,
Yeah.
and you know what, I want something different than what I play normally. Let's say
Mm-hmm.
I would roll the stat, and then I will see. Okay, what does it spark? What's interesting about that character and that combination of stats? But if I don't find anything, I'll scrap it and start over.
Let's see. What's our next question? We talk about stats. Maybe it makes sense to talk about powers.
Yeah,
What do you think?
feats and D&D, they're called stunts in the Fate system. They have different names in different systems. I feel like most systems have this like a special ability, not ability as in score, but like a special power that you can use in specific situation. So that's usually when character becomes interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely what makes them unique.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is that something that is front and center for you when you're creating a character? Is kind of like obviously the story element, and then is the next thing, okay, what is their power going to be? What's their ability going to be?
Yeah, it's pretty core to the character creation for me. At least maybe not like if let's say you start with five,
Mm-hmm.
I would say one or two are really like what's the character go to power when maybe in combat. Usually it's in combat, or maybe he's a social person. Then you would have a power to represent that.
Mm-hmm.
Having a high stat to me is not enough. You need something specific that nobody else can do, and that's where I think powers really shine.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's pretty much. Do you have anything
Yeah.
to say for?
I mean, one thing that I think that is a lot of fun to do, especially when we're talking about powers, is to talk about maybe one of your favorite powers.
Oh, that's yeah. One of my favorite powers. The first one that comes to mind, there's probably other ones, but there's in our campaign in Blood and Betrayal, Otis has one that's I don't know why it's interesting to me. It's almost like a scout where he goes ahead, looks at the situation. It's called assess the situation, and then he creates bonuses relating to different aspects. And then if he takes the time to talk to his friends, they can also use those bonuses. And that I feel like that creates mechanical bonuses, but also it brings out the character. It creates role play. It fuels different aspects of
Especially
what I like.
lately, right? Like in
Yeah.
the later half of the game, excuse me, the later half of the game when Otis was rolling this, we would actually ask him like, okay, explain to us what the advantage is.
Yeah.
And sometimes he'd come up with, oh, shoot him in the knees, he's limping. Or,
How about you?
That's a pretty cool one. For me, a cool power. I mean, I'm a little bit partial to my powers in the Blood and Betrayal campaign because they're the ones I'm the most familiar with. I really like, maybe from a game master perspective, and I'm the player in this game. But I really like Diedrich's power in the Blood and Betrayal campaign, where he can do a premonition.
Yeah.
He can sit down, hunker down, spend an evening, I think, or 5-6 hours, something like this.
It's 3 hours, but it needs to be at night.
Okay,
To
3
see the
hours
stars,
needs to
yeah.
be at night, and he can basically try to see the future. And here, try, I think, is a very important element.
Yeah.
And I think that some of the most fun direction giving, maybe, that I've had as a player was doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Where I would go in, I'd have one of these premonitions. You would use this as a tool to tell your players, or to tell me to then tell the players information that you kind of wanted me to share, but you didn't want it to be too obvious. And it allowed me to like flex my brain a little bit to try to determine why this was important, what elements I should say, what elements maybe would just kind of get confused, this kind of stuff. I thought it was really cool. I thought it led to some of the most interesting decision making that I had to make as a player ever. So talk about powers. What's the next thing? Where are you gonna go?
We talked about this. So we could talk about the team.
Yeah.
So one thing we both take into consideration, we talked about you being mannerism and me being more like a question. But one thing I think we always keep in mind is what's your place in the team?
Yeah. Dungeons and Dragons, Warhammer, Fate system, all of these role-playing games, at the end of the day, are a team game. Or at least they have the potential to be unlocked. The final form is unlocked when you're working as a team.
Yeah.
Game master included. I consider the game master and the players to all be on the same team working together. So for your party, I think we both agree here that it should be a collaborative effort that people do at least somewhat together. I know we don't always have the liberty to do it entirely together, but to have some back and forth. Okay, you're going to be this. Oh, okay, maybe I should be a more healer type because you're going to be in the front line all the time. Or, you're going to be like casting stuff from a distance. Well, you need someone to defend you, so I'm going to be like a tank that's going to absorb damage. So you kind of synergize in the tactical sense, but then obviously there's the story sense too. You can tell a much better story if people's backstories are linked together. So if you're creating your hero alone, you're coming up with this really cool backstory. You fill in all the holes, all the plot about the past 20 years of your hero's life. Not a lot of people do that, but if you did that, or you had a very good idea of who your hero was, and then you come into a team environment where you have to work with these other players.
Yeah. Having a background or a backstory that fits with the other players, and also that's why you were saying like the game master is also part of the team. It needs to be linked, I think, to the plot at least a little bit, or maybe you're linked to someone who's linked to the plot, right? So, yeah, that's part of creating a good team synergy is actually have links. I know one time we played a game that the first thing we did is, well, not the first thing, but one of the first thing was find someone you like and tell us why, and find something you dislike and tell us why. Not necessarily dislike as I don't want to work with him, but more like a coworker that's maybe you don't agree on everything with them, and that builds a team. Otherwise, you just have a bunch of individual, right?
Yeah, exactly. You and I mean you can play with a bunch of individuals. I've had games run like that. I've even in the beginning I ran games like that. But I found that it's the most fun for me when people are in it together. People are working with kind of a background, like they synergize well because they're two brothers, or they synergize well because this person's indebted to that person, and you create these really interesting relationships that basically feed the role play of your player character. And it, like you're saying, have the game master be a part of it so that they can kind of give you the quirks and personalities that reflect the story and the world that you're going to be in.
Yeah, it makes a less awkward start too. So and that's sometimes the problem. So I think that's good.
I think we could talk about this forever, but let's maybe move on to something else.
Yeah, I feel like the team synergy thing could make a whole video by itself. Then we're talking about relevance to the plot. So we kind of touched on this a little bit, having your backstory relevant to the plot, but also you quickly mentioned like leaving holes, and I think that's very important when you're creating a character, to have holes in the way you see your characters so that you can fill it with the game master's story, or at least perception of your character.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I'm trying to think, where did we get that from? Is that something that someone's theory, like, for character creation? Because for those of you that might not know, what we're talking about is when you're creating the backstory of your hero, to leave gaps. Sometimes I think important ones, like your allegiances or your family name or your political views on something that might be extremely important in the campaign. Right? That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. Having something like, when it comes up in the story, be like, you know what? That group we just met that I didn't know existed, I would like to have a link to them. Maybe like I hate them because I used to be part of them, or maybe
they killed my sister, and
maybe they're my friend, or I'm part of that association. That's the kind of holes we're talking about. Not being like, basically, not assuming that your character is fully fleshed out when you're playing, right? Kind of backtracking, adding information in your backstory as you know what's relevant to the game.
Yeah, and that's where your game master becomes a big help with this, right? If you've just finished your first or second game with them, and then you write them an email or you send them a text and say, hey, that faction you keep talking about, would it make sense for my hero to be affiliated with them, or have a rivalry with them, or whatever it is? Because then it kind of allows your character's development to be more relevant in the plot that's being told, or in the sandbox that you're exploring.
Yeah, like my character in your game, we just started playing, and I know he's highly educated, but I don't know about what yet. Like, I really don't know if there might not be anything specific, but maybe if I encounter something that I see come relevant to the plot, maybe ancient artifacts. Oh, now I'm interested in that specific group of people and their like legendary artifacts, and that's my, if the game master agrees, can become kind of centric to your character. So
yeah, no, it's and I think that's an important distinction to make. Is you can't just say, oh,
yeah,
I'm actually the king's brother. Like you have to work with your game master, obviously, and be reasonable in the things that you're saying. But I think, like you said, having an affiliation or a background that becomes advantageous and becomes relevant is perfectly reasonable.
Or disadvantageous.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah,
can also be interesting. And we had a discussion, I think, 2 weeks ago about that after the game, about what part should the GM tell the player in advance. For instance, if the game master tells you you have a rival you haven't seen for 15 years, and you're like, you kind of expect them to show up during the story. If they don't, you might be disappointed. If they do, you're not surprised. So that's an example of something we said, you know what, don't tell me in advance.
Yeah.
Just sprung it on me and be like, this guy shows up, you recognize him as your long rival.
Whatever,
yeah. And that's where the holes in the story can be filled by the game master, even if maybe you don't know it yet. We were also talking about things you should tell us in advance.
Yeah. So I think one of them was, if you're in search of someone, if you've lost a friend, they've been kidnapped or something, well, then in that case, you'd want to know, because it would drive your interactions with certain NPCs. If I spring it upon you that, oh, you found your lost sister, you might be like, oh, I had a lost sister.
Yeah, there's no build up then, right?
There's no build up. There's no drama, and you also don't really get to be involved in finding her.
No.
You might want to be, it doesn't feel as rewarding if you just find her. Whereas if you were actually taking measures to find her, and then you found her, you would feel kind of like a culmination of your efforts.
Yeah, so that's the difference between adding stuff and basically role-playing stuff you already have. So I feel like your character creation should contain those part where you like someone has sworn to kill you, then you should know, because if you just pop up and I get backstabbed and I'm like, well, I didn't know that. That's just not fair play. So that's the kind of stuff you should know, but you don't have to know everything. Some stuff are more interesting if they just pop up in the story.
So something that one of the Critical Role players has said before when he creates his player characters is he tries to think about how his character is broken. And I think he means broken in terms of their personality or their background. Is this something that resonates with you, Chris, in terms of how you create your characters?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, I like to think of a question, and sometimes this question needs to be linked to the character core motivation. And I think to know what breaks a person, what's wrong with that person, creates a lot of interesting story and questions. So the player from the Critical Role, Taliesin Jaffe, has like the most interesting characters, and they're really, really deep, and he can explore them because he knows what's wrong with them. And maybe the goal is to fix it. Maybe the goal is to realize that there was nothing to be fixed to start with. But it always creates a hero that has issues, and that's very interesting to me. And I think that segues very well in our second part is, now how do you put all these things together? And I think there's a lot of like multiple different ways. At this point, we've talked about many of them. Right now, we'd like to maybe go through what different systems do, like what D&D does, and maybe tell you about what we use, how we do it, or at least how we've done it lately.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's pull out the book. We've got the book right here, and we've got the
5th edition Player's Handbook.
So in the section that says creating a character, it starts us off with what you might expect from a rulebook. It tells you to pick a race, to pick a class, to roll your ability scores. The fourth thing it tells you to do is to describe who your character is.
Fourth, yeah.
Fifth thing is to pick equipment. And the sixth thing, described in 3 sentences, is how you fit into your party. I'll start with you, Chris. How do you feel about that order?
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I think D&D is a great system. It's the mainstream one. Everybody knows it. There's a lot of good. And I think this is a very good way to do it. But that's one way. And right there, you have 6 elements. You could start by any of them, using any of them. So maybe not necessarily the mechanics, but in terms of what you want the character to be. So that's one of maybe 6 ways, and obviously a lot more. So I think it's more about how they go in, like you mentioned it, like teamwork. You said 3 sentences, and that's kind of, when we read it, it was almost 1 sentence.
It was pretty short.
Yeah, it's like, you should consider your team. Yeah, okay, what's that, right? So I think that's when a lot of higher level play comes into the game, is what is having a good team? Like, what is having a good teamwork? So that's one of an example of one way to do it. They cannot write like 50 pages on how to create a character, right?
And I mean, I'm pretty sure that they say this is a suggestion. Yeah. Follow these steps. But if it's your first time playing a role-playing game, like the first several times I created a player character, I followed the steps. But that order to me is not how I think a good player character is created.
Mm-hmm.
I think a good player character stems from an interesting story, an interesting team, cohesion in the universe. We've found a lot of success starting with the background, starting with the teamwork, and maybe we can touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think the main thing is start with the thing that interests you. So maybe we can talk about the different ways we've done it lately.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into that.
So maybe we can go like in chronological order. So that's we started with my campaign.
Yeah.
The game master, created the core and the main maybe 3 skills of each character, and then I would give it to the players with a lot of holes for them to fill with what they wanted. Nothing really restrictive in terms of how to play them. And I would give them a backstory, maybe a secret or two that only they know. But with all that, I always tell them, whatever you want to change, you can change. This is a starting point. This is not imposed on you. It's just because creating out of a vacuum in a system you don't know and a campaign you don't know can be hard. And I also gave a list of questions for them to answer about their character. Again, to fill a backstory, just to start to flow the ideas to flow.
And I think you really allowed us the opportunity to have that emotional input, right? A lot of the questions if I remember correctly, were more motivational and emotionally driven. It was kind of like, how does your hero feel about X? How does your hero feel about their master? Or what is their opinion about something happening? I can't remember exactly what all the questions were. But
maybe it was something like, how do you feel about like power, like having someone in charge? What for you was how you feel about your master. All the questions were different from characters to character. One of the questions for Ludolf was, should you kill all mutants? And then the next question was, what about if it's a kid? I don't have an answer for that. He needs to figure it out. And that kind of came relevant in the story later. So it just fuels how you will act as your character.
Yeah, I thought those questions were really neat too. It was those kind of introspective things that made the character feel like they were ours. Because the other side of this is that the player might feel like, hey, I didn't really get a chance to create my character. But because you did that, I think the transition into playing this new system with a new hero was actually quite nice. It really eased us in, and it felt still enough of our own character because you had these elements that were open for us to interpret, to input, and to role play the way we wanted to.
Yeah, and I had a couple of players being like, that thing, no, I don't want this. Maybe I should write this instead.
And I think there's a lot of pros to this. I'm like, obviously, I won't ask you what you think the pros are because it's your system. But maybe you can chime in after. But I think there was a lot of strengths to what you did, Chris. Obviously, there are a few of the weaknesses. Like I said before, the heroes or the players might feel like they don't own the heroes; they're not their hero. But that wasn't the case. Well, for me anyway.
Maybe for you, but I think it took a while for certain players to
get into the skin of
figure out the character.
Yeah. But I do think that a big advantage that doing this had was that right out of the gate, there were NPCs, there were factions, and there were elements of the world that belonged to each player.
Yeah.
Like right out of the beginning, there was people that you were associated with, they were part of your backstory, they were part of your background. And a lot of the time, it takes a while for that to come out. In any kind of role-playing game, it takes a few games, in my experience, for these kinds of things to happen. But because they were already there, you wrote them, so you were able to kind of orchestrate having everything just right. And I think that's really, really a big strength to the way you did it.
Yeah, and having not only the NPC linked, but also the players linked, as we talked
Yeah.
before. Some of them knew each other for like days, their weeks, or their years, but they were still links. So when they would meet for the first time as like playing their character, they would not be like, "So who are you?" They would be like, "Hey, old friend," or "New acquaintance."
New acquaintance, yeah.
Yeah, they so that, but it would still begin with something, and it was relevant to the story. Some of them had basically objectives to start with, like you had letters to deliver, and to start with that, I feel is helps secure the character. Where I don't need to like it. Is it railroading? I mean, it feels like the end of a story, and I use it to fuel the campaign I'm running. So I don't think it's railroading, because you could be just like, I'm not delivering this, or I'm opening them, or whatever you want. So
Well, maybe, I mean, saying that it's railroading, I think, is a little strong. I know that
Yeah.
maybe some people might think, oh, I'm a good enough player that I can come up with these things by myself, maybe. But I honestly think that in this situation, there were so many things that were new to us that, you know, and I mean, in any situation, in a new campaign, the first game is always extremely hard to follow. There's all these factions, there's all these things. Sometimes you're in a whole new world, you don't know what's going on. So having that background there and telling us, okay, these are the things that you ought to have an opinion on,
yeah,
that was very helpful. And it, like you said, it allowed us to spark interesting conversation, interesting relationships, without having to completely improvise it. Some people might be good enough to do that right out of the gate, but it can create problems. Whereas here, I think it allowed us to steer clear of contradictory information, contradictory relationships,
yeah.
all of that.
And I said, like, if I was to do it now, I would do it differently. I think the difference would be, now you would know the lore, you would know the kind of the world and everything. So I would not have that many restriction, and I would probably do it a bit more like we did it in your campaign. So do you want to maybe talk about how we did it for your campaign, Rising Tide?
Yeah, so I'd love to talk about how we did it in our most recent campaign that we started last week or the week before.
Yeah.
You guys might not get to see it for a while, but it'll eventually work its way onto here, I'm sure.
Yes, we haven't addressed that, but like the campaign diaries are a bit lagging behind on purpose, because we want to be spoiler full, right?
But yeah, so I guess I should start with how I got to this point. In playing in the fates system, which I think is a really, really interesting system, very malleable system, they have you create a focus more on your characters. We call them aspects and troubles. I took that idea of having these aspects and merged it with an element of another game that I don't want to get into too much of the details here and get bogged down, but this other game is called Fiasco. We might have already talked about it. It's a very improv-focused game, very little rules. But one of the things that Fiasco does very well is it creates links between each person before the game starts. So in Fiasco, what you do is you have people sitting beside you, and in each of these relationships, you have to say something you like about that person and something that you dislike about the other person. And it's never going to be something completely game breaking, but it might be something like, oh, this person here is my brother, and I really dislike that they're super bossy. Okay, so now that helps fuel your interactions with that person. Same thing with the positive one. You might, oh, this person here, I know because they're on my soccer team, and I really like them because they take charge of, of situations. So I took these two elements and tried to find a way to have you guys work together to develop that. So what I did, which I don't think is very revolutionary, was I had you guys, all of the players, come in for a session 0, where I had everybody come in and talk to each other about what they wanted to play in this upcoming campaign.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important part that links to what we were saying before. Like, you all asked us, find basically something you're interested in. So, for example, the hook guy, I had my quirkiness. Another one had more of a, I think your wife had something more about class, right? She wanted to be a healer.
Yeah, she wanted to be more healer focused.
Yes, and I don't remember the other one, the other player, what he brought. I think
he kind of wanted to be magic.
Yeah, so it was kind of class too, but that shows you different. Like I didn't have any idea of class or anything, so we all brought something and then we discussed, and we had multiple ideas. I had maybe 3 core ideas that could be different characters or that could be regrouped in one characters, and pretty much everybody had that. And then we had a discussion about, before rolling stats, before figuring out any of the details, it's like, would that idea work with the other 3 ideas?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
If not, chuck it.
And I think something that was important too is I gave you guys some background. I said, okay, you guys are almost like restrictions, really. I was like, you guys are all on a pirate ship. You're all a crew on a pirate ship who likes each other, who works together. Go. And then that's when
you cannot be the captain.
Yeah, and you can't be the captain because I have a really cool NPC for that.
Yeah. And otherwise, it's like someone's ahead and the other way. Can create other problems. So yeah, and I really like that. I thought that was a really neat idea of bringing everybody together. Again, common purpose. Then you can have your individuality following those restrictions. Sometimes more restriction creates more imagination, and that was a good example of it, I think. And you also talked a bit about the lore before we started, and if you talked about the lore, and someone would be like, "Oh, that like I want to make that part of my character for sure." Yeah. And so we had a long discussion.
Yeah, and I think what was really fun about that discussion was you guys were very open and very honest about what you wanted and what you didn't want. And it worked really well. It was almost as if the 4 players were creating the party together, not their characters. It was 4 people working together to create a party of heroes that would work together. Obviously, each player had a hero that they wanted to be, so they would kind of insert their opinions. They're like, oh, I really wanted my hero to be more like this or like that. And then everybody worked together so that everybody had what they wanted. And again, by saying have what they wanted, we're not talking about powers, we're not talking about stats, we're just talking about the role that each of these heroes was going to fill in the party and their relationships with one another. And that fueled everything else.
Yeah. Sometimes you would mention a power or stat or something, but it really came at the end. And again, like I was saying previously, once we had all this discussion, it was pretty clear for the main skills and even the main perks or powers or talents or whatever you want to call it. And then that just really helped with the creation of the characters. And then you as the game master, because again, that's a system that is really malleable. You basically ended the creation by yourself, by creating all the perks. We were giving you tools and fuels, and we were asking you to basically finish the creation. So it was almost the opposite of what I did, right?
It kind of was.
I created everything, and I asked you to finish the characters, where we kind of did. Well, you were part of that creation too of the team. You weren't there just not saying anything. You were helping us also.
Yeah, and I definitely see the weaknesses in it. I mean, the strengths were, I think, speak for themselves. That you had we had a team of heroes that clearly want to work together now. Even after the first game, I think it was really cool. There was all these relationships pre-established.
Yeah, the first game went very smoothly because of it. Because we started and we knew exactly where everybody was standing. We knew everybody's core backstory, our links to them. We started right away, really, really quick, as if it was our 3rd or 4th game.
Yeah, it was really, really nice. But I do think that the weakness here is, and it's kind of the opposite, like you said, of what you did, was that now you guys have these heroes that have these affiliations to factions that you don't maybe really know. Right? Like you have these holes, like you said, your hero is a scholar, but you don't really know what yet.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if we did it in your way, I probably would have, or you
Yeah.
probably would have said, you're a scholar in this thing. That's your stick or shtick.
Yeah. Knowing that it's going to be
Important.
as relevant as I want it to be. Maybe it's not super specific, but it's still. I'm not going to make you the scholar about food when we're going into a place there's no food. I don't know.
Exactly.
That's a stupid example, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. So that's something that I've been thinking about, and I've been trying to come up with ways to
Retroactively.
Yeah, almost retroactively give you guys the opportunity to make those decisions. Something that I've been toying with, I'm not sure if I'm going to have the chance to do it because I don't think this campaign is going to be too long, but I'm almost thinking of doing like a multiple choice where I say, okay, your hero is, I'm going to use the example again, you studied this thing, is it A, B, or C?
That's good.
A being the lore of the pirates, B being temples and their architecture, or C being the social etiquette of the Makoan tribal people, something like this. And then you get to decide, like, okay, at least I know that all of these things are relevant because I'm the one that came up with them, but it gives you enough freedom to steer your character in the direction you want.
I like that. It might be a lot of like more work for you because you have to basically come up with 3 ideas for everything,
and they're all potentially relevant, basically.
That might give me information about the future.
Exactly.
In this example, I knew pretty much all of this, so that's no spoilers for me. But yeah, it's. But I like the idea of having a choice that you kind of had a hand into.
Yeah.
Maybe the other way to do it is ask me for something, and I give you my idea. Maybe it's archaeology, and then you tell me if that's a good idea or not, or you put a twist on it, so that way you might not have to create multiple.
Yeah. But I wonder how that would go in an environment where you're creating a hero, and most of the hero that you're creating is almost like the result of taking a test, where the whole thing is like multiple choice questions, where it's like, okay, you already have kind of an idea of what your background is going to be. Okay, so then how does your hero feel about this? A, B, or C. Okay, how does your hero feel about that? A, B, or C. What's your relationship with this person? Good, bad, or I don't know. I'm just throwing ideas out there. That might be interesting.
Yeah, to have an actual, like, I would see a system. Maybe my system, the fate system, I could create like a part that's character creation that would just be a list like of a tree of question that ends up at a certain spot and give you.
And based on these answers and where you find yourself in that tree, you now know how your hero is going to respond to certain role play situations. You know what your skills might be because you, I don't know, maybe we're getting into some really weird stuff.
Yeah, that's just that's not helping you, but we're just talking here.
Yeah, but maybe it's something that you could do when you're creating your hero is talk to your game master and see if you can work together to come up with options. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I think what we're saying is creating a character in a vacuum is to us at least not very interesting, even if it's super min-maxed and it's super good at doing something. And again, min-maxing is like, what are you min-maxing for? If you min-max to do a lot of damage, well, if your game master doesn't do combat that much, you're not really maxing right now. So it really depends on the game. So to me, min-maxing is, I won't say irrelevant, but it's depends so much on the game that it's not the important part for me. So I think the last thing maybe we should add is the secret plot, the behind the scene. I mentioned quickly that when I created the characters for everybody, I put secrets in there. Maybe not super mind-blowing secrets, more like something you can keep for yourself until it becomes relevant and you can bring it up as you want. But in your method, it becomes a bit harder.
It does. I kind of initially wanted to give you guys these secrets after, So after hearing what everybody wanted to be and how they wanted their heroes to play out, and the relationships, actually, that was a big part of it. After I heard all of these things, I was going to take the responsibility upon myself to look into the story that, I was trying to tell, look at the sandbox that you guys found yourselves in, and then find secrets that would be, like you said, somewhat relevant, and then give them to you maybe in the second game.
Okay.
I'll tell you now, I haven't done that.
Yeah, we're playing later. So.
Yeah. But my solution to that in the first game anyway was I had a lot of moments where I took players aside. And I said, okay, you know what? I'm going to come tell you this because you're really the only one that should know this.
Sometimes it was perception check. Sometimes it was empathy or insight check or stuff like that. But yeah.
Yeah, so that was kind of my band-aid solution to not having created those secrets yet. Was saying, okay, I'm going to take these people aside, tell them this information, and then when we go back to the table, they can tell it. It's not secret in the sense that nobody ought to know this information. It's just secret in the sense that only you know that information. And now you get to role play that information back to your team. And I think that that's a similar result.
It is. I think so too.
It does create pacing problems, I think, where, I'm taking people away from the table or whispering things or whatever. But it definitely saved me the effort and time of having to go and come up with these things.
Yeah, but I think it's like you said, it's a good band-aid. It's not like maybe core to the character, but it's core to the relation between the character and the story. And for instance, in one of the situations, you told me something I knew about a picture on a map, and I was the only one who knew that. And I talked to another character that, like, let's say, I'm simplifying here, but his tribe, like, it's linked to his tribe, and that created a bond between the both of us. And then I was like, I promise you, or I won't tell the others. Now, link. Now it builds something. So I think that was a clever way to bring those secrets element.
And I think I'm going to keep doing it as long as it's not too frequent.
Yeah, we were talking about pacing. I feel like for the first game, it was really good, and it gave us a lot of lore also behind. And I know another of our player, who's the hook guy, he told us after the game there was basically 3 things you told him, like 3 different times. And one he told us basically directly. The other one he half told us. And the last one he didn't tell us anything about it because he wanted to keep it for himself. So now it's interesting. Like, I want to know. And he wants to explore that. So, yeah.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens. But I think that for the most part, that sums up a lot of character creation.
Maybe the only thing I want to finish on for the secret thing is maybe you don't need a secret, right? We assume, we like that. We like to have the secret element to our character. But I know some groups that they don't really care about that. They're more about a team fulfilling a destiny, or just a team of adventurer kicking down a door, or any variation of that you don't need to have a secret from your team, because the drawback is maybe someone is a traitor.
Yeah.
And then
I could have a whole episode talking about traitors.
Yeah. So it might not help team synergy if everybody has secrets.
Yeah.
So that's something to take into account too. You don't need those.
Here I was saying I was done. I'm not. That makes me think of something. I think important context here is that the secrets that you're creating, or at least in our environment, I don't think it's constructive if those secrets necessarily punish the rest of the party.
Or even oppose.
Or oppose them. It should really be, this is information that your hero knows, or background that your hero has, or a relationship that you might have. But when push comes to shove, that secret shouldn't supersede, or shouldn't be more important than the rest of your party.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the importance of this group synergy and establishing the group synergy early on, like we did in our session 0, or even, in using other tools, it's important to have that relationship built and have it strong.
Mm-hmm.
Because then when you bring the secrets in, you don't have to worry about, oh, if this person knows this secret, are they going to go and betray everybody because now they have this vital piece of information and they can take it and run. And it's like, that's...
Yeah, I think you're totally right. It's a secret needs to be something that defines part of you. And it might be interesting when it comes up to see how the other players react, like the other characters react to this secret. Maybe they don't really like it, but they're your friend, so they won't, like, they want to learn about it, and then it becomes part of the character creation and relationships. But like, even something when I said I promised that character and I won't tell the other ones, I said I won't tell them unless it becomes relevant, right? And that's, I think it's a good, like, I hope it becomes relevant and I tell the other ones, and then it creates something interesting, right? But it might not, and that's okay too. So yeah, it creates opportunity, but it should not create a position. And unless you wanted to, that's how we'd like it. But it could be a nice end of a campaign if, like, a secret, well, it should be built on, but something happens, and like in our Blood and Betrayal, we'll talk about it in the campaign diary, but at the end of the campaign, there's a secret that came up that could have gone horribly wrong.
It didn't, because I think we as players all kind of had each other's back, and we wanted to kind of work together, I guess.
Yeah, but ultimately it was the choice of the player.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, he, I think, put the party before the progress of his character. It could have gone the other way around, where he would have said, you know what, this character's motivations push him to do one thing, boom, now we find ourselves in a completely different situation.
Yeah, and that happened with another character. Anyway.
Well, you'll find out.
You'll find out. All right, that was a really good chat.
Yeah, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about how we feel about, rolling stats, min-maxing character classes.
We also talked about team synergy and how we include it as a priority in our character creation.
Something that we also challenge is the order that the rulebooks give you. We feel that it's nice to try and spin it around and start from maybe the story elements instead of the statistic elements.
Yeah, so the book is really great at leading, especially new players or players that don't really know what they're going to build. But yeah, challenging it is the way we really like to create our characters. And we've talked about different ways we did that. I think one of the ways, like the way we did it in your campaign was really good. Just also, like, we tried to create the team first, and that was really fun.
Yeah, and I think we've started to have a pretty good understanding of how to create a strong party. But obviously, if this is something that you've had experience doing with your players or with your game master, we would love for you to tell us. So please engage with us and let us know, how have you had success in creating a strong party that works together and that's linked to the narrative.
I would like to see like weird ways to do it. Not necessarily what the book says, right? Something very interesting. I would love to see it in the comment below.
So I encourage you to reach out to us. Our contact information can be found down below. Or you can email us, go to Twitter and all that stuff.
Email, Twitter.
For now, that's it.
And it was a very interesting discussion, and we're looking forward to seeing you again in the future.
Absolutely. So I think that sums it up, Chris.
Yeah, that's pretty much it, Matt.
Let's call it a chat.